Hello, learners, and welcome to this 11th lecture in the NPTEL course on 20th century women's novels. For quite some time now, we have been very closely following the lives and the parallel tracks of these two individuals, two fictional characters who are the dual protagonists of Nella Larsen's 1929 novel, Passing. For the next lecture or two, also, we will continue doing that. I have consciously decided to spend a considerable number of lectures and a considerable amount of the total time that's allotted to this course doing a very close reading of this novel, because I feel that it establishes for us the many ways in which the 20th century Anglophone novel, as written by a selection of women writers, is a very powerful intellectual tradition. It's not just important because a certain English professor says so, but also because I believe these are incredibly contemporary documents. I'm surprised, and very pleasantly so, surprised to learn that they remain very contemporary. They continue to address many contemporary concerns. And so I find it to be profitable that we stay with Passing for a little more time. And we can move a little faster when we cover other novels. But some novels, and I think Passing deserves that, also because it is the first novel in this course, it really helps us cover all of the intellectual bases and to see the ample justification that there exists for devoting a considerable amount of time and energy and devoting professional academic attention to the study of this kind of text, that is the 20th century Anglophone novel by women writers. So I'll talk about two major intellectual themes in this set of lectures today. The first is that of secrecy. Secrecy is a theme that is as old as modern literature itself. In the past, I have referred to the scholarly work titled The Epistemology of the Closet by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. And I've mentioned how the plot of Passing is driven forward, propelled quite literally by the difficulty of keeping secrets, and at the same time, the compulsion and the compelling force that one feels to keep secrets, and the attraction and even, one might say, a kind of pleasure that one can derive from keeping a secret. So secrecy is important, and I don't want to give a theoretical definition of secrecy. It's a common enough idea. But as I was thinking about secrecy, and specifically as I was thinking about the way these two individuals, that is Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield, are brought together, sometimes despite their best intentions. Despite Irene's intentions, they are brought together. The narrative says a lot about secrecy. It is not simply an inconvenience of modern life. Secrecy is formative of many of the things that define modern life, and especially modern life as it could be experienced by individuals who happen to share the fate of these two individuals. That is, individuals who were born into the recently ascendant, recently liberated Black middle class, but who were also born with light skin, and so who had the opportunity, if they chose, to pass as white. For these individuals, secrecy was a very, very important defining aspect of their lives. But the novel is not really about passing in a sociological sense. The novel is about the psychology of two individuals, of the relationship between two individuals who happen to have diametrically opposite views about the meaning, the utility, the value, the ethics, and even the morality of passing. That is what really gives the novel its intellectual and ethical force. So as I was trying to find some sort of literary precursors or literary forebears to this idea of secrecy, I was thinking that the kind of canon that the scholar Eve Sedgwick creates for us, the canon of British literature, in which friendship is a code for homosocial bonding. That literature is, of course, a very important literary precursor to the examination of secrecy as a formative and defining feature of modern life. But if one leaves aside the somewhat identificatory idea of queerness, it's not simply that one needs to think about minority identities in order to understand the importance of secrecy. Secrecy remains a very powerful theme of modern literature. And as I was preparing for this lecture today, and as I was thinking about this novel, I was reminded of a very powerful moment from another novel, also by a woman novelist, also an English novel, not from the 20th century. In fact, it was written much earlier. And there's a very powerful moment in that novel which helps us understand and helps shed a very literary and canonical light on the depiction of the relationship between these two women, which is governed by a very tenuous and very precarious management of the burden of keeping a secret. The novel that I'm thinking about is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Some of you may know, and those of you who've taken my English novel course, also offered on NPTEL, will also recognize I discuss Austen's Pride and Prejudice in that course. Sense and Sensibility is an amazingly powerful novel and among my personal favorite novels. And there's a moment in which the two sisters, the Dashwood sisters, who are the dual protagonists of Sense and Sensibility, in a way that Irene and Claire are the dual protagonists of Passing. Irene and Claire are not sisters in the literal sense, although they are sisters in the sense that they develop a very precarious form of solidarity. And in a way, the tragedy of the novel is the failure of that solidarity, to the inability of that solidarity to transform into anything actionable. So they can be called sisters in a very powerful sense of the word. And of course, they are sisters if one thinks of the way the word sisters is used in contemporary Black vernacular. The quote from Sense and Sensibility, which I think about a lot and which very powerfully comes to mind, reads thus. This is a speech or a sentence or a set of sentences that are spoken by Eleanor to Marianne. A little bit about the context. Marianne, in Sense and Sensibility, is seen until that moment as the one who feels more feelings, or who is certainly very expressive about them. And Eleanor, until that point, is seen as, or is perceived by others as someone who is very rational and doesn't give way to feelings very easily. In this moment, however, that perception is very powerfully reversed. And the context for that moment is that Marianne accuses her elder sister of not understanding or not having the sensitivity or the empathy to appreciate what Marianne, is going through, because she has had her heart broken because Willoughby, a romantic partner that she had, has abandoned her. And without Marianne's knowing it, Eleanor, her elder sister, who she is accusing of being insensitive, has actually been going through a lot of problems of her own. But because of a certain circumstances, Eleanor is not able to share the details of that with her younger sister as Marianne has been. And so this is the speech that Eleanor gives. What do you know of my heart? What do you know of anything but your own suffering? For weeks, Marianne, I've had this pressing on me without being at liberty to speak of it to a single creature. It was forced on me by the very person whose prior claims ruined all my hope. I have endured her exaltations again and again, whilst knowing myself to be divided from Edward forever. Believe me, Marianne, had I not been bound to silence, I could have provided proof enough of a broken heart, even for you. Now, it's the sentiment that Eleanor ends with, that if the circumstances had not arranged themselves thus, if the logistics or if the arrangement of time, space, people, if the practical matters were a little bit different from what they are, right, then she too could have indulged herself, like Marianne does, in talking about her broken heart. And so the phrase that Austen uses is, I could have provided proof enough of a broken heart. So the irony here is that talking seems to provide proof of a broken heart. Whereas for Eleanor, it's not about the talk, it's not about what you say, rather, it's what you experience. And so it is only a matter of chance that Eleanor is not able to say those things. But in terms of the experience of feeling heartbreak, she is no less. And in fact, she doesn't need to demonstrate. But they live in a universe in which proof comes from demonstrations or expressions which are limited to words. Now, those of you who are curious about this passage can read on, and I won't spoil the novel by explaining why Eleanor is in this situation and what has happened between Edward and Eleanor, but I'll give enough of a clue. The relationship between Edward and Eleanor has been broken, but for some reason, Eleanor could not really even express to her sister that she was going through heartbreak. Now, the reason I bring it up, and although the differences between Jane Austen and Nella Larsen are legion, I'm not even for a minute saying that these two writers are comparable. But there is a very powerful way in which secrecy and the different choices that two individual women make, and their different approaches to carrying the burden of a secret, or in fact, the choice that one makes to not carry it at all, is a very powerful subject for an English novel. It's a powerful subject because it keeps two different sensibilities together. And those of you who've been reading or who have read Passing will know very clearly how the parallel can fit. Irene Redfield is the character who most closely resembles Eleanor Dashwood, and Claire Kendry is the character who most closely resembles Marianne Dashwood. The context is different, again, I keep repeating this, but there are several moments in Passing in which Irene repeatedly says something about Claire which repeats this very idea in different words. And what is that idea which is repeated? The idea that's repeated is that Claire, from Irene's perspective, is indulgent, is a bit selfish, more than a bit selfish. The word selfish, self-centered, and its cognate terms are used repeatedly. The narrator, who for most of the novel speaks through Irene's perspective, through the free indirect discourse, repeatedly characterizes Claire as someone who doesn't care for other people. The only thing Claire cares about is the satisfaction of her desires, the indulgence of her feelings. And this curdles or thickens, this judgment thickens into very powerful moral indictment from Irene's perspective. There are moments when this moral indictment thaws and melts into something that's akin to a kind of attraction. But there are key moments, and at least in the first part of the novel, when Irene repeatedly forces herself to say things and believe things so that she can continue disliking Claire. And these things all have the same tone, that Claire indulges herself because she doesn't care for others. And the unspoken implication in these accusations of selfishness is that had Irene chosen to act as selfishly as Claire, she could have done so. And the implication here is Irene could have passed. Irene could have had all of those benefits. Irene could have taken those risks if she wanted to. The reason Irene did not take those risks was not only because she didn't really want those things. That is the first and obvious reason, and the reason that's not very important for Irene is that Irene did not have such a strong desire for these luxurious, comfortable things, the so-called good life as Claire. But this is not the most important reason or the most telling reason. For Irene, the most important reason is because for why she didn't pass, even though she could have, is because she cared for others. She cared for what others like her who did not pass or who could not pass. And by others, she means the community, people who share her racial lineage, her economic and race based lineage. She cared for them, and this is why she did not make the same choice that Claire made. And this accusation of selfishness comes through very powerfully where Claire invites Irene to her house and her temporary house because she's visiting Chicago. And there at her house, she meets two people. That is, Irene meets two people other than Claire. Gertrude, another woman, light skinned woman who was on the spectrum, that is, who might have passed in some context, but who was not passing permanently like Claire, Gertrude. And another person, that is Claire's husband, John Bellew. And this character, John Bellew, says things and behaves in an extremely horrific, violent, and racist manner. It is the behavior of John Bellew which Claire tolerates, only chiding him occasionally in a very affectionate and very weak manner. But more than that, it is the expectation that Claire has from Gertrude and Irene, black women who occasionally passed and who passed in that situation. That is, as friends of Claire, for John, Irene and Gertrude were also white. And he could not tell that they were actually black, and so he pretended to talk as he normally did when he assumed that everyone in the audience or in the room was white. And the result of this assumption was that he said some extremely racist things. And of course, the first and obvious consequence of John Bellew saying racist things about the African American race or the individuals or derogatory, stereotypical things like African American people were prone to crime or things like that. The first and obvious consequence of things like this is the kind of indignation they produce for Irene and Gertrude, and the pressure that Irene and Gertrude feel to suppress their indignation, to not show their anger, but instead to show their gratitude and to continue to pretend to enjoy the benefits of being in good society. That is, the pressure these two women face to continue sipping tea and make small talk, compliments, and behave as people are expected to behave in polite society, despite seething with violent rage inside. This is the first and obvious consequence. This is not very important. But what's more important is what emerges from this initial reaction. And what emerges from this initial reaction is the implication that Claire is someone who tolerates this on an everyday basis. That Irene and Gertrude are subjected to it only once because they are visiting, but Claire tolerates it on a daily basis. Maybe Claire is okay with it, but the fact that Claire expects people like her, that is Irene and Gertrude, not only to enjoy it, if not to enjoy it, then to very happily tolerate it, to view this kind of treatment as worth the price of the comforts of living in white people's societies. That thought is quite offensive to Irene. And it is that thought that Claire considers this kind of humiliation to be worth the comfort, and not only for herself, but also for others. And the really selfish thing that Claire is doing in this whole invitation, gathering, conversation, friendship, is that Claire expects others to tolerate the humiliation that she has chosen to tolerate because they are friends of Claire's and because Claire wants their friendship or wants their company. So ultimately, from the perspective of Irene and Gertrude to some extent, Claire's desire to remain connected with these two women who knew her and who know her as Black, even though now she passes for white, becomes a kind of domination. It's a kind of overwhelming force that Claire exerts on these two women. It's a dominant force, it's an overwhelming force because Claire expects these two women to behave as John Bellew recognizes them as, that is, white women, and as white women to tolerate the kind of views, the kind of violent, stereotypical descriptions, and quite frankly, quite horrific descriptions that John Bellew has to share. So Claire's desire for herself to remain connected with the kind of people that she believes she belongs with, that desire translates into a kind of violence for the very people she desires to be with. And that is the moral, intellectual, and emotional takeaway from that chapter. I believe it's the third chapter of the novel. And friendship becomes a violence or becomes an act of violence on the very people that one seeks to reconnect with and the very people with whom one longs to rekindle one's friendship with. This is ultimately also a tragedy. At this point in the novel, Irene has not yet understood this as tragedy because Irene has also not accepted how much she enjoys what feels like a desire for friendship, but is also ultimately manifested as a kind of violence. The twist in the knife will come a little bit later in the novel when Irene begins to admit to herself, with a little bit of hesitation, that what she calls as a very, very selfish, arrogant desire for friendship, and which is ignorant of how this desire for friendship is experienced as violence by others, this kind of a very harsh judgment that Irene has for Claire, Irene reluctantly admits that Irene finds this very honesty, the very audacity of this kind of a feeling attractive. And it is attractive because it teaches Irene something about her own repression, and it gives Irene a very tantalizing glimpse of the possibilities that could open to her if only she had chosen not to deny herself certain opportunities. So I'll now quote some important sections from still the first section of the novel. And the two most offensive things that Irene and Gertrude get to hear from John Bellew are first the word that John Bellew uses when he enters the home and sees Claire, his wife. The word he uses is the N word. It's a shortened version of the N word. It's N-I-G. And immediately, Irene and Gertrude are shocked. And after that, because it is considered to be somewhat offensive to use this language, John explains why he uses that term. And he explains why he uses this word to address his wife. Claire actually invites him to give that explanation because Claire thinks that maybe this can be a way to diffuse the tension. And here is how John answers. Well, you see, it's like this. When we were first married, she was as white as Lily. But I declare she's getting darker and darker. I tell her she don't look out. She'll wake up one of these days and find she's turned into an N-word. So this is the first instance in which the offensive word, the N-word, is detached from its legal racial connotation and turned into purely a description of color. Now, the irony in this scene is that a white man can do this intellectual work. He can detach the word from its racial, moral, violent connotations and refer to it simply as a darker shade. Now, I've referred to the US Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, and this was a case in which a black man argued for the same thing. The argument was that since racial segregation is based on the shade or the tone of skin color, if there is a person who is only 1/8 black and 7/8 white and has visibly light skin, then he should be allowed the benefits that white people have. In that case, the Supreme Court had said no and had connected racial segregation to a theoretical fact. That is, how many people in one's lineage were identified as black, how many identified as white, and so on. And so here the critique is that race, however it may be defined, is always reliant on these extremely hypocritical double standards. This conversation goes further, and Claire asks, out of jest and partly to diffuse the tension and to relax the mood in the room, because she can very obviously tell that her two friends are not taking very kindly to this kind of discourse. So Claire toys with Jack's racist views further and asks him an idle question out of curiosity, saying, "My goodness, Jack, what difference would it make if, after all these years, you were to find out that I was 1 or 2% colored?" To which her husband says, "Oh no, nothing like that with me. I know you're no N-word, so it's all right. You can get as black as you please as far as I'm concerned. Since I know you're no N-word, I draw the line at that. No N-word in my family. Never have been and never will be." So again, the same idea is taken to its logical limit and becomes almost ridiculous. The statement almost makes no sense. And the irony again is that a statement that makes no sense, logically speaking, seems to make sense when it is spoken by a person who wields a great deal of social and economic privilege in the society of the time. So what is that thing which makes no sense? He's saying to his wife that you can get as black as can be, but as far as I'm concerned, I know you're not a Negro. That is, you're not identified, you're not legally speaking a black person. So complexion has nothing to do with the legal identification of race. And here again, John Bellew speaks the exact language or replicates the exact logic that was used by the US Supreme Court in Homer Plessy's case, which is skin color is maybe one evidence or maybe one manifestation of how racial identity is defined, but ultimately skin color is not the full definition of racial identity. In fact, identity exists or persists in the absence of the expected or obvious skin color. So while it is likely that someone with darker skin might be black, and this is the concession that John Bellew gives, he says that yes, if it had been someone else, that is, if he had not known Claire to be his wife, then he would have assumed that her darkening skin color might have suggested that she is actually black. But in this case, because he knows that, or he believes, and therefore he knows that she is white, she can get as black as she wants. So again, the hypocrisies are exposed, and the narrator describes who carries the burden of these hypocrisies. The novel is very much a product of the evolving relations between the races. The novel is very much a product of the prehistory of the civil rights movement. And as I've mentioned, Nella Larsen passed away before civil rights became a reality in the US, but we can see very clearly how the novel lays the foundation for the intellectual growth and development of civil rights as a reality in the US. I'll stop here and continue discussing the novel in the next lecture. Thank you.